There was a pause on the phone before my mother spoke again. Not long, just long enough to understand that something had already been decided without me. She thought it would be easier this way. No explanation, no hesitation. In the background, I could hear voices, laughter, glasses touching, a room I was not in. I asked what she meant, and she repeated the same sentence, softer this time, like it would hurt less if she lowered her voice. "It's her wedding. We didn't want complications." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice, but I noticed something she didn't say. No one had told me until now, and everything about that silence felt planned. I did not think of my life as complicated. It was structured. Predictable in a way that made other people uncomfortable when they tried to describe it, but stable enough that no one questioned the results. I woke up early, earlier than I needed to. There was a routine to it, quiet, almost automatic. Coffee, emails, numbers. I preferred starting the day before anyone else needed something from me. It gave me time to think without interruption. Most of my work happened in silence. Spreadsheets, reports, decisions that rarely required discussion once I had made them. People trusted my judgment, even if they did not always understand how I reached it. That trust had been built slowly, over years of not making mistakes, or at least not making visible ones. My parents never asked much about what I actually did. They understood the outcome more than the process. Bills were paid, repairs were handled. Problems disappeared before they had time to become visible. That was enough. Every month I transferred money to them. It was not a conversation. It had never been presented as one. At some point, it had simply become expected. Utilities, groceries, occasional medical expenses, things that added up quietly over time. I tracked everything on my end, not because I needed to, but because I preferred knowing where things stood. It gave me a sense of order. They never asked how much I sent. They never asked if it was difficult, and I never volunteered the answer. When I visited, which was less often than they would have preferred but more often than they acknowledged, the house looked the same. The same furniture. The same arrangement of things that had not moved in years. My mother would comment on small details, how I looked thinner or more tired or too serious, as she liked to say. My father spoke less, but when he did, it was usually about practical things. Repairs, costs, small concerns that had already been resolved before I arrived. There was a rhythm to those visits. Predictable conversations, predictable silences. I learned early not to interrupt either. My sister was different. She had always been easier for them to understand, more expressive, more willing to say what she felt, even when it changed from one moment to the next. When we were younger, that difference had been framed as personality. She was emotional, I was not. Over time, it became something else. She called more often than I did. Sent messages that were less precise, more frequent. Photos. Updates about things that did not require solutions. Things that simply existed. I responded when she reached out, but rarely initiated. Not because I did not care, but because I had never learned how to participate in that kind of conversation without feeling like I was forcing it. Still, there was no conflict. That was the important part. We did not argue. We did not disagree in ways that required resolution. If anything, our distance made things easier. There was less to manage. When she mentioned the engagement, it came in the middle of a longer message. Not as an announcement, but as something already decided. "It's happening," she wrote. "I'll tell you everything later." I remember reading it twice, not because I was surprised, but because of how casually it was presented, like something that had been discussed with everyone else first, then passed along to me as an update. I replied with a simple acknowledgement. "Let me know what you need." It was the kind of response I always gave, direct, open-ended, practical. She reacted with a short message. Gratitude, I think, or something close to it. After that, nothing changed immediately. My parents mention the wedding occasionally, but always in general terms. They're planning things. It's going well. You know how she is. Details were never part of those conversations. I assumed they would come later. There was no reason to think otherwise. If anything, I expected to be involved in the parts that required structure, logistics, payments, decisions that needed to be made carefully. That had always been my role, not visible but necessary. And I was used to that, used to being included without being asked, used to understanding what was expected without it being explained. Looking back, that assumption feels less like trust and more like habit. But at the time, it did not feel wrong. It felt normal. Nothing in their voices suggested otherwise. Nothing in the way they spoke to me hinted at distance or exclusion. If there were decisions being made, they existed somewhere just outside the conversations I was part of. Close enough to sense, but not close enough to see. I did not question it. There was no immediate reason to. Everything still functioned the way it always had. And in my experience, when systems functioned, it meant they were intact. I relied on that, more than I realized. The first time something felt off, it was small enough to ignore. My mother mentioned a dress fitting, not in detail. Just a passing comment placed between two unrelated thoughts as if it did not carry any weight. "They went a look at dresses yesterday," she said. "It took longer than expected." I waited for her to continue. She didn't. There was no description of what my sister chose. No mention of who went with her. No frustration, no excitement. Just the statement and then a shift to something else entirely. I let it pass. Later that week, I called my sister. It was not unusual for me to wait a few days before following up. Our conversations had always worked that way, delayed, spaced out, practical. She answered on the third ring. Her voice sounded normal, not distant, not distracted, just controlled. I asked about the wedding. There was a pause, not long but noticeable. "It's coming together," she said. "Still figuring things out." I asked about the dress. Another pause. "It's not finalized," she replied. "Just looking for now." The answer matched the version my mother had given me, but something about it felt incomplete, like a simplified version of a longer story that had already been told somewhere else. I did not press further. I shifted the conversation to safer ground, work, schedules, things that did not require her to fill in details she was choosing to leave out. When the call ended, there was no clear reason to feel unsettled, but the feeling stayed. A few days later, my father mentioned the venue. "They've narrowed it down," he said. Again, no specifics. No location, no timeline, just the implication that decisions were being made. I asked which venues they were considering. He hesitated, then gave me a name I did not recognize. I looked it up after the call. It was already booked for several months ahead. I checked the availability calendar twice to be sure. There were no open dates in the window that would make sense for a wedding being figured out. I told myself it could be outdated information. Websites were not always accurate. Still, I took note of it. After that, I started noticing patterns. Conversations would slow down when I asked direct questions, not stop completely, but shift, subtly redirected into generalities. If I asked when, I got soon. If I asked where, I got we're still deciding. If I asked who's involved, I got just close people. The answers were not wrong. They were just incomplete. And consistent in that incompleteness. At one point, I received a message from a relative I had not spoken to in months. A simple question. "Are you flying in early or closer to the date?" I read it twice. There was no date mentioned in any conversation I had been part of. I replied carefully. "I haven't seen the schedule yet." There was a short delay before they responded. "Oh, I thought you knew." Nothing else followed. No clarification, no correction. Just that sentence, left without explanation. I did not respond again. Instead, I went back through my messages with my sister. There was no mention of a confirmed date, no invitation, no outline, no request for availability, only that initial message. "It's happening." I sat with that for a while, not reacting, just reviewing. The absence of information began to feel more deliberate than accidental. Still, I did not confront anyone. There is a point, in situations like this, where asking direct questions forces an answer that cannot be taken back. I was not ready for that yet. Instead, I adjusted. I listened more carefully, paid attention to what was not being said rather than what was. The tone of conversations mattered more than the content. The pauses, the way certain topics closed too quickly. Once I started noticing it, it became difficult to ignore. My mother stopped bringing up the wedding unless I did first. My father kept his updates brief, almost rehearsed. And my sister, she responded when I reached out but never expanded beyond what was asked. There was no conflict, no argument, nothing that could be pointed to as a problem. But the space between what I knew and what was happening continued to grow, quietly, without explanation. And for the first time, I considered the possibility that I was not simply being overlooked. I was being managed. The first confirmation did not come from my family. It came from someone who assumed I already knew. I was in the middle of a workday when the message appeared. A name I recognized, but not someone I spoke to often. A distant cousin. The kind of connection that exists more through family structure than personal relationship. There was no greeting, just a photo. I opened it without thinking. It was a table setting, neutral tones. Carefully arranged plates, folded linen, a small card placed at the center of each setting. I zoomed in. My sister's name was printed on the card, alongside a date. I read it once, then again slower. The date was fixed, not tentative, not suggested, printed, final. For a moment I assumed it was an old plan, something that had been considered and then changed. But the rest of the image did not support that. Everything looked recent, deliberate, designed. I checked the timestamp on the message. Sent that morning. Below the image, a short line. "Looks beautiful, you must have seen this already." I did not reply. Instead, I saved the image and set my phone down. There are moments when reacting immediately only creates noise. I had learned to let information settle before deciding what it meant. But the conclusion was already forming, not slowly, not uncertainly, just clearly. I opened my laptop and searched for the venue name my father had mentioned days earlier. This time I looked beyond availability. Event pages, public listings, vendor posts. It did not take long. A catering company had shared a preview. A floral designer had posted a sample arrangement, each tagged with the same date, the same one printed on the card. There was no indication that this was still being figured out. It was planned, documented, shared, just not with me. I closed the browser and sat back. The room was quiet. No immediate anger. No shock that demanded expression. Just a steady awareness that something had shifted from assumption to confirmation. I thought about calling my sister. The idea came and went quickly. A direct question would require a direct answer, and I was not sure I would get one. Not yet. Later that evening, my mother called. Her tone was the same as always, light, casual, as if nothing had changed. She asked about work. I answered. She mentioned something about the weather, about a neighbor, about small things that filled space without requiring attention. I listened, waited. Eventually, I asked, "When is the wedding?" There was a pause, longer than the ones before. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, controlled but uneven. "We're still deciding," she said. The sentence was delivered carefully, too carefully. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I let the silence extend just slightly beyond what was comfortable. Then I gave her the date, the one from the card, Another pause, this one heavier. "Where did you hear that?" she asked. The question was not surprised, it was measured, as if she already understood the answer did not matter. I did not explain. "I just wanted to confirm," I said, her voice softened. "It's not finalized," she replied. "Things change." But the certainty was gone, replaced with something else, containment. After the call ended, I did not feel confusion. That part had already passed. What remained was structure. Pieces of information aligning in a way that no longer allowed for alternative explanations. This was not miscommunication, it was coordination. The same details shared across multiple sources, consistent everywhere except in the conversations I was part of. That level of consistency does not happen accidentally. It requires agreement. I thought back to the earlier conversations, the pauses, the incomplete answers. They were not gaps. They were boundaries, and I had been staying within them without realizing they had been set. That night, I reviewed everything again. Messages, dates, references that had seemed minor before. They all pointed in the same direction, not toward a mistake, but toward a decision that had already been made, one that I had not been included in, and more importantly, one that no one had intended to explain. I did not confront them immediately. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to understand how far the narrative would go without pressure. There is a difference between what people say when they are asked directly and what they reveal when they believe they are still in control of the story. For a few days, I said nothing. I continued my routine. Work remained unchanged. The transfers went through as they always had. Conversations stayed surface level, predictable, almost rehearsed, but I listened more closely. And when the next opportunity came, I did not avoid it. My father called in the evening. His tone was practical as usual. He mentioned a minor repair at the house, something already handled, something that did not require my involvement. I let him finish. Then I asked again, "When is the wedding?" This time there was no attempt to avoid the question, but the answer did not come immediately either. "We told you," he said finally. "It's still being planned." The phrasing was different. Not "we're deciding." "We told you." A subtle shift. I let the words sit between us. "No," I said evenly. "You didn't." Silence followed, not confused, not uncertain, measured. "You've been busy," he replied. "We didn't want to overwhelm you with details." I did not interrupt. "We mentioned it," he continued. "Maybe you don't remember." The sentence was delivered without accusation, but it carried one. Memory, not communication, had become the issue. I recognized the structure immediately. It was not denial, it was redirection. I kept my voice steady. "I remember the conversations," I said. "There was no date." Another pause, then a shift in tone, slightly firmer. "Why does it matter right now?" he asked. "You'll be told everything when it's finalized." The question was not genuine, it was a boundary. I could either accept it or push against it. I chose neither. "I already know the date," I said. This time the silence was different. He did not ask how. He did not deny it. Instead, he moved to the next step. "If you know, then why are you asking?" A simple question, positioned to make the conversation unnecessary, to make my concern seem excessive. I let a few seconds pass before answering. "Because you didn't tell me." There was a faint shift in his breathing, then more controlled than before. "You're making this into something it is." There it was. Not a denial of the facts, a redefinition of their significance. I said nothing. He continued. "Your sister has a lot going on. There are many moving parts. Not everything needs to be discussed immediately." Each sentence was reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern. Minimize the omission, justify the delay, reframe the expectation. I had seen it before. Not in this context, but in others, professional, structured environments where clarity was replaced with controlled ambiguity. The goal was not to convince, it was to stabilize. To keep the situation within acceptable limits. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I understand, I said. The words came easily because they were true. I did understand, just not in the way he intended. After that, the conversation ended quickly. He returned to practical matters, small details, neutral topics, as if nothing significant had been said. Later that night, my mother called. The timing was not accidental. Her tone was softer, concerned but carefully measured. "Your father said you seemed upset," she began. "I'm not," I replied, a brief pause. "You know how your sister is," she said. "She gets overwhelmed. We didn't want to add pressure." I did not respond immediately. "She thought it would be easier this way," my mother continued. "To tell you once everything was settled." The same phrase, repeated, refined, positioned as consideration, not exclusion. I let her finish. Then I asked a different question. "Was I invited?" Silence, not long, but complete. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "Of course you are," she said, but the certainty was gone, replaced with something less stable, conditional. "Then why wasn't I told?" I asked. She hesitated. "You're overthinking this," she said. "It's not personal." Another shift, from explanation to evaluation. The focus moved from their actions to my perception. I recognized it for what it was, not an attempt to clarify, an attempt to close the conversation. I did not resist it. "All right," I said. I could feel the conversation settling, returning to a place where nothing would be resolved. But something had already changed. Not in what they were saying, in how clearly I could see it. This was no longer a misunderstanding that could be corrected with better communication. It was a structure, maintained through omission, reinforced through dismissal. And I had just been positioned outside of it, not directly, but deliberately. After the call ended, I sat in the same quiet room, the same controlled environment I had built for myself. Nothing around me had changed, but the way I understood my place within their system had. And once that clarity is established, it does not reverse. After that conversation, I stopped asking direct questions, not because I no longer wanted answers, but because I had already reached the point where answers would not change the structure of what was happening. The pattern was clear. What remained was confirmation, and confirmation does not come from what people choose to say. It comes from everything they do not control. I shifted my attention outward. Not toward confrontation, but toward systems, records. The quiet trails people leave behind when they assume no one is looking closely. The first thing I did was review my own transactions. Every transfer to my parents was documented, categorized, consistent: utilities, groceries, maintenance. Occasional larger amounts labeled broadly: house, expenses, support. Nothing unusual. Then I looked at timing. Dates of transfers aligned closely with increases in activity from their side. More calls, slightly warmer tone, more engagement in small conversations. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to register when viewed together. I did not interpret it immediately. I simply noted it. A few days later, another message arrived. This time from someone I worked with, though not directly. We had mutual connections, enough familiarity to exchange occasional updates, nothing more. "Are you coordinating travel with your family or going separately?" I read the message twice. Again, an assumption, not a question formed from uncertainty, but from shared understanding. "I haven't received details yet," I replied. There was a delay before the response came. "Oh, I thought you were handling some of it." Handling. The word stayed with me. It implied involvement, responsibility. A role that had already been assigned in other conversations, just not with me. I did not ask for clarification. Instead, I asked something simpler. "Who mentioned that?" Another pause, then a name. One of my parents' longtime acquaintances. Someone who had no reason to fabricate information. I thanked them and ended the exchange. That was enough. By that point, I was no longer trying to determine whether I was being excluded. I was mapping how widely that exclusion had been communicated and how it had been framed. Later that week, I visited my parents' house. I did not announce it in advance. There was no particular reason given. I arrived in the late afternoon at a time when they would both be home. The house looked the same, unchanged, predictable. My mother seemed surprised but not alarmed. My father acknowledged me with a brief nod, then returned to what he had been doing. Nothing in their reactions suggested urgency, which told me something important. They did not expect this visit to create a problem. That meant they believed the situation was still contained. We sat together for a while, small talk, neutral topics. I did not bring up the wedding, instead I observed. On the side table near the living room, there was a stack of papers, not hidden, not displayed either, placed casually as if they belonged there. I recognized the format immediately. Printed confirmations, vendor invoices, structured documents that followed a familiar pattern. I did not reach for them. I did not need to. One page was partially visible, just enough to read a header. Final schedule. The date matched the one I had already seen. Beneath it, a list of times, ceremony, reception, coordination details, organized, complete, final. I looked away before either of them noticed where my attention had been. There was no reason to create a moment out of it. The information had already done its work. A few minutes later, my mother stood and gathered the papers. Not abruptly, but with a slight shift in awareness. She moved them to another room without comment. That was the only acknowledgement, subtle but clear. They knew what those documents represented, and they knew I had not been meant to see them. Still, no one said anything. The conversation continued as if nothing had changed. Dinner was offered. I declined. Not out of discomfort, but because there was no need to extend the visit. Before I left, my father mentioned an upcoming bill. Routine. Expected. I nodded. "I'll take care of it," I said. The words came automatically. But as I said them, I understood something with more precision than before. The roles had not changed. Only the boundaries had. I stepped outside into the evening air, the quiet settling around me in the same familiar way. Nothing had been confirmed directly. No one had admitted anything. But the structure was no longer hidden. It was visible in documents, in conversations, in assumptions made by people who were not part of the immediate situation, and in the way my presence had been managed within it. That level of coordination does not happen without intention. It does not sustain itself without agreement. I did not feel anger, not in the way people expect. What I felt was clarity, and clarity, once established, changes the nature of every decision that follows. I drove home without turning on the radio. The silence was easier to process. By the time I arrived, I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I understood it. The only question left was what I would do with that understanding. After that visit, I stopped reacting entirely, not externally. The routine remained intact. Transfers continued. Messages were answered. Calls were returned. From the outside, nothing had changed, but internally, I had shifted from participant to observer. I was no longer trying to maintain the system. I was studying it. The first thing I did was review every recurring commitment tied to my parents' finances. Not casually, but in full detail. Accounts, payment schedules, automatic transfers. Utilities were linked to my account directly. Property taxes scheduled quarterly. Insurance premiums tied to long-standing policies I had set up years earlier. Even smaller things, subscription services, maintenance contracts, ran through structures I had built and maintained without interruption. It had never been presented as control, only responsibility. Now I looked at it differently, not as a burden, but as a network. One that functioned smoothly because it was centralized. and because no one else had needed to understand how it worked, I did not make changes immediately. That would have been noticeable. Instead, I documented everything. Dates, dependencies, points of failure. What would stop if one element was removed? What would continue? What required active management versus what would collapse quietly on its own? There was no urgency in the process. Precision mattered more than speed. At the same time, I continued listening. The tone of conversations began to shift slightly. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to confirm that something had changed on their side as well. My mother called more frequently. Small check-ins that did not carry information, only presence. "How are you?" she would ask. The question lingered longer than before, as if waiting for something more than a routine answer. "I'm fine," I would say, and she would pause as though expecting elaboration that never came. My father became more deliberate in his conversations, less casual, more structured. He mentioned upcoming expenses earlier than necessary, framed them as reminders rather than requests. "There's a payment coming up next week," he said during one call. "Just so you know." I noted the phrasing, "just so you know," not "can you handle it?" Not "we need help." The assumption remained intact, but the tone had shifted toward reinforcement, as if the system needed to be quietly maintained without drawing attention to its reliance on me. My sister remained the most consistent, distant but not entirely absent. She sent occasional messages, updates that felt curated, photos of venues, decorations, fragments of preparation that revealed progress without context, no direct mention of dates, no acknowledgement of what I already knew. At one point, she sent an image of a seating arrangement, names arranged across multiple tables. I scanned it carefully. My name was not there. I did not react. I did not ask. I simply saved the image, another piece of confirmation, another detail that aligned with everything else. Days passed, then weeks. The wedding date moved closer. The system around me remained stable, but the pressure within it increased. Not visibly, but structurally. The closer the event came, the more dependent the situation became on continuity. Payments had to be made, services had to remain active. No one addressed it directly, but the expectation was present in every interaction. Unspoken, relied upon, I made a small adjustment, one that would not be noticed immediately. I removed a single automatic payment from my account, a minor one. Non-essential, something that could be resolved easily if addressed. Then I waited. It took 5 days. On the 6th, my father called. His tone was calm, but there was a slight tension beneath it. "There was an issue with one of the payments," he said. "It didn't go through." I listened. He explained the situation in detail, more than necessary, dates, amounts, possible reasons, all framed as information, not accusation, not request, just context. I let him finish. "I'll look into it," I said. The answer was neutral, expected. There was a pause. Then, carefully, "Everything all right on your end?" The question carried more weight than the words suggested. It was not about the payment. It was about stability. I considered the response. "Yes," I said, "everything is fine." Another pause, longer this time. Then he moved on. The issue was resolved later that day, quietly, without further discussion. But the shift had occurred. They had noticed. Not the full structure, just a single disruption. Enough to create awareness, not enough to understand the pattern. I returned the system to normal, for now. The point had not been to create a problem, it had been to measure response. And the response told me everything I needed to know. They were not monitoring the system. They were relying on it completely. And they assumed it would continue, indefinitely. That assumption was the only thing holding everything in place. As the wedding approached, that reliance deepened, not because anything had changed, but because nothing had. Consistency had created certainty, and certainty had created vulnerability. I did not rush. There was no need. The structure was already in motion. All I had to do was decide when to step out of it. The decision did not come all at once. It formed gradually in the space left behind after everything else had settled. By that point, there were no remaining questions, no missing details, no uncertainty about what had been done or how deliberately it had been carried out. What remained was simpler, whether I would continue participating in it. For a few days, I did nothing. Not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to understand the full weight of the choice before making it. There is a difference between reacting to a situation and concluding it. Reaction is immediate. Conclusion is permanent. I had spent most of my life maintaining systems that functioned without interruption. Fixing problems before they became visible, ensuring stability without needing recognition. That role had never been formally assigned, but it had been accepted by them and by me. Now, for the first time, I considered what it meant to step out of it, not partially, not symbolically, but completely. There would be no announcement, no explanation that could be debated or reframed, just absence. The thought was not dramatic. It was precise. I reviewed everything again. Not because I needed confirmation, but because I needed clarity on the consequences. Not for them, for myself. The financial support was not insignificant. It sustained more than day-to-day expenses. It maintained continuity. Without it, adjustments would be required. Not immediately catastrophic, but noticeable, gradual pressure building where there had previously been none. I understood that, and I understood something else. They had made their decision under the assumption that my role would remain unchanged, that I would continue to support a structure I was no longer part of, not visibly, but fundamentally. I did not interpret that as cruelty or even hostility. It was something quieter, more normalized. They had adapted to my presence as a function, reliable, consistent, always available, not something that required negotiation. That realization did not create anger. It created distance. And distance, when it reaches a certain point, removes the need for confrontation. There was nothing left to argue. No version of this situation where a conversation would restore balance, because balance had never been part of the structure to begin with. I thought about the wedding, not the event itself, but what it represented. A moment that had been planned, finalized, and distributed across an entire network of people, vendors, relatives, acquaintances, everyone aligned, everyone informed. Except me, and not by accident, that distinction mattered. I sat with that for a long time, long enough that the emotional weight shifted into something quieter, less reactive, more settled. By the time I reached a decision, it did not feel like a response to them. It felt like a correction, not of what they had done, but of what I had allowed. I opened my laptop and began making adjustments, not abrupt ones, structured, measured. The first step was removing direct links. Accounts that were tied exclusively to my name were separated, payments rerouted, access redefined. Anything that required my continuous involvement was transitioned into something that could function independently if they chose to maintain it, or stop if they did not. I did not disable everything at once. That would have been disruptive, visible. Instead, I created a sequence, a gradual withdrawal of support that would not trigger immediate alarm, but would become undeniable over time. Each change was documented, not for them, for me. Clarity required records. Once the structure was in place, I stopped. There was no need to rush the rest. The system would carry itself forward from here. I closed my laptop and sat back. The room was quiet, the same as it had always been. Nothing external had changed. No calls, no messages, no confrontation. But internally, something had shifted completely. The role I had occupied for years, unquestioned, uninterrupted, was no longer active. Not in the way they understood it. and not in the way I had maintained it. There was no sense of relief, no satisfaction, just a steady awareness that a line had been drawn, not between them and me, but between what had been assumed and what would continue. I did not inform them. There was nothing to explain. They would notice. Eventually. And when they did, there would be no misunderstanding about what had changed. Only the absence of what had once been constant. I stood, turned off the light, and left the room as it was, unchanged. Except for one thing, I was no longer holding it together. The first effects were small, not dramatic, not immediate, just slight interruptions in a system that had never been interrupted before. A payment delayed by a few days. A service that required manual confirmation instead of renewing automatically. Notifications that would normally have been handled before they were ever seen. Individually, none of it demanded attention. Together, they began to create friction. I did not monitor their reactions directly. I did not need to. The system itself reflected the pressure. 3 days after the first sequence completed, my mother called. Her voice carried a light concern, carefully controlled. "There was a message about one of the bills," she said. "It said something about reauthorization." I listened. She explained it in vague terms, reading parts of the notification without fully understanding what it meant. That was expected. These were systems she had never needed to manage. "I'll take a look," I said, the same response as always. But this time I did not act immediately. I waited, not to create discomfort, but to allow the process to unfold without intervention. By the next day, my father called. His tone was more direct. "There are a few things that need to be updated," he said. "Some of the payments aren't going through the way they used to." I could hear something beneath the words, not frustration, awareness. "I'll review it," I replied, again neutral, again expected. Another pause followed, longer this time. Then, carefully, "Is everything set on your end?" The same question as before, but now it carried context. He was not asking about a single payment. He was asking about the system. "Yes," I said, "everything is in order." The answer was accurate. Just not in the way he assumed. Over the next week, more issues surfaced. Nothing severe, but consistent. A subscription service lapsed. A maintenance appointment had to be rescheduled because confirmation had not been processed. Small things that required attention, time, adjustment. They began handling them. At first, tentatively, then with increasing urgency. I could tell from the way they spoke. The conversations became more focused, less casual. Each call carried a purpose, a problem to be resolved, information to be clarified. The tone shifted from assumption to verification. They were no longer operating within a system that functioned automatically. They were interacting with it for the first time. My sister did not call, but her messages changed, less frequent, shorter. At one point, she sent a simple question. "Are you coming?" No context, no acknowledgement of everything that had already happened, just the question. I read it once, then again. There was no expectation of a full conversation, only confirmation. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I looked at the date, the same one that had been printed, shared, finalized without me. Then I set the phone down. Later that evening, I replied, "I won't be there." There was no follow-up, no explanation offered, no justification required. Her response came an hour later, a single message. "Okay," nothing else. No argument, no attempt to change my decision, just acceptance. Or something that resembled it. The following days were quieter, not because the situation had resolved, but because it had settled into a new shape. My parents called less frequently. When they did, the conversations were brief, focused. There was no mention of the wedding, no attempt to revisit the earlier discussions, only practical matters, handled more cautiously now, with an awareness that something fundamental had changed. By the time the wedding date arrived, the system had fully adjusted. not smoothly, but functionally. They had adapted where they could, delayed what they couldn't, reorganized responsibilities that had previously been invisible. The event itself passed without interruption. From what I could tell, everything proceeded as planned. Guests attended. Vendors delivered. The structure held. But it held differently, not because I had disrupted it completely, but because I had removed the part of it that had never been acknowledged. And once that absence is felt, it cannot be reinterpreted. Only managed. I did not receive photos, no messages during the day, no updates. The silence was complete, not forced, not dramatic, just consistent with everything that had come before. That evening, I reviewed my accounts one last time. Everything was stable on my end. On theirs, the adjustments would continue. Gradually, quietly, without discussion. The consequences had not arrived all at once. They had unfolded in sequence, measured, controlled, undeniable. And there was nothing left to explain. The day after the wedding passed without acknowledgement. No messages, no photos, no delayed updates meant to include me after the fact, just silence. It was not difficult to understand why. There was no version of that day that could be explained in a way that made sense from both sides. No narrative that could include me without exposing the absence that had been created deliberately. So nothing was offered, and I did not ask. The routine remained. Work continued. My schedule stayed the same. The systems I had rebuilt on my end required less attention now. Fewer variables, fewer dependencies, simpler. My parents called a few days later. Not together. Separate conversations, both brief. My mother spoke about small things, the house, a neighbor, the weather. Her tone was careful, as if avoiding certain subjects would keep everything stable. My father was more direct. "There were some changes," he said. "We're managing." I listened. There was no request in his voice, only recognition. "I understand," I replied, and that was enough. My sister did not call again. There were no follow-up messages. Whatever needed to be said between us had already been reduced to that single exchange. "Are you coming?" "I won't be there." "Okay." It remained that way, clear, final. Time moved forward without resistance. Not quickly, not slowly. Just steadily. There was no sense of resolution in the way people expect. No apology that arrived later. No confrontation that clarified everything. Only a shift in structure that held. The absence of what I had once provided settled into their lives just as their absence had settled into mine. Not dramatically, but permanently. I did not feel the need to revisit it. There was nothing left to recover. Some relationships do not end with conflict. They end with adjustment, with roles removed, with expectations no longer met, quietly, completely. And once that happens, there is nothing left to repair, only what remains. And what remains is enough to understand that the system, as it was, no longer exists. Not broken, just finished.